One of the questions that's been raised by skeptics of Christianity and the claims of Christianity is about the reliability of the four New Testament Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. The claim is made that these Gospels are unreliable because they're not the work of eyewitnesses. This claim is supposedly based on the assumption that these Gospels only surfaced around the 2nd century. Some concession is made that perhaps the Gospel of Mark, generally regarded as the oldest of the four Gospels, may have appeared as early as 75 AD. And as such, it's just impossible that these Gospels were written by the eyewitnesses, since most of these eyewitnesses died well before even 75 AD. Well, what do we do with a claim like this, that the New Testament Gospels are unreliable? Firstly, it's built on some faulty assumptions. The assumption that these Gospels didn't appear until the 2nd century isn't actually grounded in historical fact. These Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, were well in circulation by around 60 AD. Now this is borne out by the fact that we know that Paul's epistles were written to some of these churches that he wrote to in the mid-50s. And in some of those, for example 1 Corinthians, Paul actually cites the Gospel of Mark. It's known that the Gospel of Mark was the first, the oldest, the earliest of the four Gospel accounts. And it appears that Luke, when he wrote his Gospel, based his Gospel on the structure of the Gospel of Mark. So the Gospel of Mark was known to be in existence by the mid-50s, not 75 AD. Luke wrote his Gospel with a compendium book, what we call the Acts of the Apostles. This was presented, largely held to be by scholars, that Luke wrote this as a part of a defence document for the Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul was about to stand trial before Caesar, and Luke, a qualified historian, gathered eyewitness accounts, he interviewed primary sources, and he compiled his Gospel. He makes reference to the other Gospel accounts being in circulation, of which we presume one of those was the Gospel of Mark, and we find Luke writing his Gospel and the compendium book, the book of Acts, up until the events leading up to Paul's ultimate execution, which we know happened in 64 AD. So we know that the Gospel of Luke must have been written before 64 AD at the very latest. He cites at least the structure of Mark, if not actual accounts in Mark, which further adds weight to the evidence that Mark was indeed an eyewitness account. Now, some have pointed out that even if you grant that the authors, who are traditionally held to be the authors of the Gospel, were indeed the authors, only two of those were eyewitness accounts, that being Matthew and John. But we've already established that Luke went to great historical exercise to make sure that his Gospel was a record that was accurate. Now these Gospels were compiled around about mid-50s to 60 AD, or rather in circulation by then. There was still plenty of living eyewitnesses to these events, that if these Gospels were promoting something that was known to be wrong, there would have been a public outcry, and there wasn't. What we have is something that, when it was in circulation, it was widely accepted as being historically verifiable and accurate. The Gospel of Mark is widely considered by scholars to actually be the work of the Apostle Peter. Mark simply being Peter's, if you like, secretary, who wrote down the account of the Apostle Peter. Of course, it's also argued that Mark himself was probably an eyewitness to many of the events described in the Gospels as well, and there's one allusion to, that's believed to be to Mark, when Christ is taken in the Garden of Gethsemane. And so we have the historical data supporting that Matthew, one of the 12 disciples, was actually the author of the Gospel of Matthew, and that this Gospel was in circulation well before 60 AD. Mark's Gospel is known and must have been in circulation before the mid-50s, because Paul cites it in some of his epistles, and Luke bases his Gospel on the structure of Mark, and Luke would have written his Gospel well before 64 AD. Now, of course, the big elephant in the room as to why these Gospels could not have appeared after the first century is the biggest event in first century history to a Jew was the destruction of Jerusalem and ultimately the temple. Now, this event was prophesied and recorded, prophesied by Christ and recorded in Matthew chapter 24, Mark chapter 13 and Luke chapter 21. We have there Christ prophesying the unimaginable, the unthinkable, something that his audience really struggled with when they heard it, and that was that Jerusalem would eventually be overrun. It would be besieged and eventually the temple itself would be destroyed. Well, this was unthinkable. But what's even more unthinkable is that when it actually did happen, in the events leading up to 70 AD, and the temple was literally destroyed just as Christ had prophesied, what is more unthinkable is that the gospel writers writing after 70 AD would have omitted to include the fulfillment of that prophecy. That is just incomprehensible. It's unimaginable that they would leave out such a detail. It would be like writing the modern history of the city of New York and leaving out September 11. You wouldn't do it. And so you could see how if the gospel writers had written after 70 AD and not included the events of the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, that they could be accused of writing prophecy as history. That is, they could be accused of saying, well, yes, Christ predicted this. We told you this was going to happen. See, here's the record. If they had written their Gospels after 70 AD. But the record stands. These Gospels were in circulation well before 70 AD. The prophetic claim of Christ that Jerusalem would be destroyed and that the temple would be destroyed was published before it happened. Thus, leaving us to conclude either Christ was guessing or he really was prophesying something that God, his Father, had shown him. So that adds great weight to the credibility, the reliability of the 4 New Testament Gospels. If you'd like more information on the Bible and how it's relevant for today, I invite you to visit andrewcorbett.net.